And we are live. Oh, but we lost Josh.
I'm back. I think I'm back.
There you are.
Yes. And hello, everybody. We're live.
Hello. Hello from the Dark Ozarks, and hope everyone had a good weekend.
Yes. Yes. A good, safe, productive, relatively sane weekend from all of us to all of you.
Exactly. Well, maybe not the same part from our end.
It's a it's a daily struggle.
Well, we threw out a couple of oddly paired topics today.
Yes, excited about that.
Spooklights and Kewpies.
Oh, they've probably never been paired together before, but
Probably not. It probably is a first. Exactly. And although when you think about it, they're in Ozark lore, it's not necessarily that surprising.
True. Very, very true. And there's certainly some when you get into the aspects of Fae, there are some crossover on that. And of course the Joplin Spooklight or Earthlight is extremely well known in some circles.
Mm-hmm. It's probably the best known ghost light or earth light, at least in the United States. There's the one Marva, Texas, and then we actually have a second one in the Ozarks in Gurdon, Arkansas. Yes,
and tell me, well, the only other one, and I know that there's the potential of others. I know that there's one reported to be in Virginia called the Brown Mountain Light. And
though a lot of people will classify the Brown Mountain as more ET because it usually appears way above the mountain.
Okay.
Okay.
So
maybe there's Brown Mountain. There's one in Michigan too, and I can't think of the name of it off the top of my head. But and I know there's some in China and different places around the world.
Mm-hmm. And of course there is a crossover, and we've talked about that a little bit. A crossover with Will-o'-the-Wisps. And
you might tell people what that is if they're not familiar.
Right. It's well, and apparently it also Will-o'-the-Wisp also spawned a video game creatures, which I was unaware of until I was teaching a writing class to teenagers, and two of them would not stop writing about wisps, and I'm like, what? Until I finally figured out it was a modern take on an old classic. It was a take on on Will-o'-the-Wisp. So, but of course it is tied to the tradition of the jack-o'-lantern with Samhain or Samhain and Halloween. Pardon me, I just finished eating really fast.
Yeah, same here.
And there's a lot of connections. It is interesting because and this is probably a good indicator that it may indeed be some sort of natural energy phenomenon, because it does show up in many different locations around the world with then attached folklore with it. But the creepiest one, or the most sad, I don't know, that kind of goes hand in hand, is a Scandinavian, a Christian Scandinavian folklore that says that the Will-o'-the-Wisp or the swamp lights or the ghost lights are the souls of lost or unbaptized children or infants. And then there's also the the attachment of that they lead you into danger if you follow them. So there's the sense of enchantment, and there's the sense that there's the temptation to follow them. In some cases, not a lot, but in some cases, there's the idea that they might lead you to treasure, but then they just don't, and you die, and you join them. And it was the Dead Marshes from Tolkien really did a good job of representing them. And then, of course, Peter Jackson did a magnificent job of creating the Dark Marshes at the very beginning of the Two Towers. And so that's, I think, where the Will-o'-the-Wisp, or the concept of the Will-o'-the-Wisp, re-entered popular culture and folklore, was with the second Lord of the Rings film. But I was familiar with the Will-o'-the-Wisp, and I'd be curious if anybody else started this way too. There was a 1950s Scrooge McDuck comic book that Scrooge and Donald Duck and Huey, Dewey, and Louie discovered a Will-o'-the-Wisp, and there was some sort of bad guy also in regards to the marsh. I don't remember if he was trying to drain the marsh and build land on. I don't remember what he was doing, but the Will-o'-the-Wisp was actually a very friendly creature that Huey, Dewey, and Louie made friends with, and then in a very cathartic finishing moment. And I think the bad guy was Black Pete. Black Pete was frightened away by the Will-o'-the-Wisp, which was actually Huey, Dewey, and Louie's newfound friend. So good times. And so that is, of course, that connection.
Well, and and of course the folklore is very similar to fae and fairy folk, and similar cautionary tales associated, at least. And so I think it becomes sort of natural that those kind of explanations get connected with Spooklights, Earthlights. You get a lot of explanations that are swamp gas or things like that. Let's start a little bit with Gurdon, the Gurdon light.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm not very familiar with that.
Yeah, and then we can tie it in with the Joplin Spooklight. It's very similar in that the behavior of the lights is described exactly the same.
Okay.
Light can change colors. It can be, blues, reds, greens, whites. It bobs around. It's not in the same place all the time. And it can chase people. It will, appear, disappear, appear behind you, that kind of thing. Exactly like the Joplin Spooklight. But with Gurdon, it only goes back to the 1930s.
Okay.
And I'm not sure, if it was there before, why it wasn't discussed before, but I can't find any reference to it before the 30s. And a little different setting. It's in the woods, and it's along a now deactivated railroad track. Okay. And basically, there's two versions of the lore of what is the light. Both of them have to do with being a railroad lantern. The first one is that there was an accident, railroad derailment, and a worker was killed. His head was severed, and they never found his head. And the story being that the light is his lantern as he's looking for his head. And the second one is interesting because it's very specific, and it's based on a real event. In 1931, there was a gruesome murder along the railroad track of a railroad foreman by one of his workers. William Mclean was killed by Lewis McBride, and basically Mclean disappeared, and they at first they couldn't find him apparently. And McBride started acting very suspicious, and as they arrested him to question him, and he ended up confessing that he had killed his boss and told them where to find him. And basically, the newspaper articles say it was a very grisly scene with a bloody trail of over a quarter mile. He basically had attacked Mclean with a maul, and he had gotten away and ran. And later on down the road, there was a struggle, and there were at least four severe blows to the head. And apparently McBride left, and he was able to, Mclean basically got up and pulled himself a ways on down the road after that before he collapsed and died.
Wow.
And so the story is, and an interesting note, and this may be where the lantern comes in for both versions, is the police said that amazingly through all of this, the victim had never let go of the lantern that was in his hand.
Oh.
And so that version of the story is it's actually Mclean basically haunting the area and the light of his lantern.
Mm-hmm. So this brings up a question, because of course this is more of a specific murder that is seemingly attached to this phenomena, as opposed to the Joplin Spooklight.
Right.
What do you think of, and of course we've talked about the idea that paranormal activity and released energy tend to go together, that where things are very extremely heightened, where emotions are extremely heightened, both good and bad, can be a point, was sort of a center point for focusing energy, and a center point for focusing potentially, or in this case, paranormal energy and activity. What do you think? Do you think that an individual, like, for example, I mean, what you just described, an enormous amount of intensity of emotion,
it's kind of like a Lizzie Borden type situation.
Yeah. And do you think that could release and then create a phenomena like this?
I think it's possible. I mean, I think there's certainly places that have had very gruesome murders like that do have a haunting that I think is created by that. The flip side is, maybe was there a light there before? I don't know. And was that because people weren't walking out in the woods right there? I'm not sure. But there is an interesting theory that's been proposed about that light that does not apply to the Joplin Spooklight. And that is that the light is caused by piezoelectricity. And basically, now, geologically, it's a very similar area. It's limestone with a lot of crystal. And piezoelectricity is when basically there's a lot of stress on the rock, and basically it bends the crystals, and electricity or sparks are released.
Okay.
And the interesting thing about that makes that maybe possible is apparently this Gurdon sits on the New Madrid Fault.
Wow. So that is really fascinating.
The other popular theory is that it's headlights.
Right.
much like Joplin as a theory. Apparently there is a highway in the distance, and headlights will appear as, something bobbing or floating. And honestly, I I'm not sure the angle of the road, so I'm not sure if it's coming dead on. So I'm not sure if you would see two lights or just one. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But a lot of the materials that I've been able to find, particularly over the last 20 years, there's been a stress on the piezoelectricity theory.
Very fair. Well, that and with that limestone base, there's a lot of lore that is attached to that quartz limestone base, and of course, it is also rich in quartz crystal, Arkansas diamonds. One of my favorite things in the whole world is actually Arkansas diamonds. I got my first one when I was about 5, and I still have it. It's around here somewhere. But I think that something, and I've been down past Gurdon. I've not been to Gurdon. Of course, it's just off of Interstate 30, between Little Rock and Texarkana. And what I'm looking at, of course, folks down there, I need to go back to be really authoritative on this, but essentially what I'm looking at is it's a little bit to the south of the Ouachita Mountain Range.
Mm-hmm.
and of course, socioculturally, that is very much part of Ozarks culture, or Ouachita culture is very much, or Ozarks is very much part of Ouachita is very much part of Ozarks. and I consider, as editor-in-chief of State of the Ozarks, I consider the Ouachitas to be included in our story coverage range, because it is such a similar and interesting mountain culture. Something that I'm also fascinated by is that the Ouachitas are not actually the same as the Ozark Mountains. I would definitely include them in Dark Ozarks from a storytelling perspective, but from a geological perspective, they are a different mountain range that stretches out into southern Oklahoma.
Right. And basically anthropologists would say it's Ozarks, geologists say it's different, but
Yeah.
It's not very far from the mountains either. But
no, basically just across the Arkansas River Valley.
Mm-hmm. And I think the fact that and actually so much of the history of the Ozarks actually comes up through that valley and in
Yes.
that river, that you can't discount any of it. But
no, I would not.
I really wonder, if there were sightings previously. And like I said, I really haven't found anything. If anyone knows of anything, please let us know. I'm really curious. That really predates that murder. And it may well be that, it just happened to be a spot out in the woods that people weren't out there a whole lot.
And that is, I think, especially when you're dealing with the potential of naturally occurring phenomena, there's a lot of places we simply may not know about because there aren't people there. Right.
Just because we're not there doesn't mean it isn't going on. And
exactly.
And so, when would it have been noticed if the railroad hadn't gone through? I don't know. And so, but it's still seen, and it's curious too, because it develops sort of the same community involvement, I guess you'd say, that the Joplin Spooklight did from the 30s through, say, the 60s. People went out, carloads of people went out to look for it and everything. People had all kinds of tales. And then apparently, as they decommissioned that part of the railroad and took out rails, etc., apparently it's a little harder to access. And I've read a few accounts of people kind of getting lost trying to find it, that if they're not real familiar with it. So I'm not sure if we'll lose some of those tales or not, but it's certainly, to me, I mean, it's certainly a story that has more of a potential credibility of paranormal activity than I would say the Joplin Spooklight does. But because of the murder. But on the by the same token, I'm really fascinated with the fact that it's sitting on a fault line and the geology there.
Absolutely. And you think about one of my favorite places, this is kind of going off on a tangent, but really two of my favorite places in the Ozarks. One of them is Talking Rocks Cavern, and one of them is Bluff Dwellers, Talking Rocks Cavern in Branson West, and Bluff Dwellers Cave in Knoll.
Yes.
And something that to me is just, it's very powerful, is the sort of the latent energy or the stored energy or the intensity of, it's almost like a monument being within the earth and being within that stone. And you think, we think of rock as being very static, that it's just, oh, it's rock or it's gravel or that's a nice rock. But there is something both with quartz and limestone and just these inner spaces that is at the very least, it is emotionally compelling. We know that Native Americans had a lot of reverence for those spaces, in addition to, of course, using those spaces, and that they were, in many cases, very important sacrifice and ceremonial places. You think about that energy. You think about that energy multiplied through the fault lines, through the Earth's crust. It really opens the door to speculation of what is possible.
Exactly. Well, I always feel when I'm in those spaces, and Bluff Dwellers is a good example of that. Just it's sacred space, and you can feel a difference in the energy there. And it might not be a cave there, but when you're talking about a fault line that is suppressing against, the sides are pressing against each other, and there is microscopic movement. There are a number of earthquakes detected on that fault regularly. So the fact that there might be a spot where electricity is released, I can't say that I dispute that. So
yeah, and it's really, there's so many layers of possibility, and I think that, well, first of all, I think that the reflection of car headlights it's very pedantic and it's a very mundane answer, and of course it's easy to say, well, pick those answers, because why not? But I think something that bears some introspection is the idea that our mundane world, quote unquote, is filled with such amazing wonder, and we oftentimes just completely overlook it.
Oh yeah, I agree with you there.
And
it really is amazing. But it's another thing, another aspect of that is, and it always gets me, and this comes up with, well, things like the Spooklight or say Bigfoot accounts or whatever, particularly when they come from hunters or native people who are in that element a lot, and people say, oh, it's a bear.
Right.
And that, when you're talking about people that they know what a bear is capable of, they know how it moves on two legs, etc., and then to say, oh, you don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And I think the modern version is the car lights. I mean, it's just to say, basically thousands of people have had these experiences at both lights. And
Mhm.
all of
Yeah.
them are so foolish that they don't understand how car lights work, you know, because we never see car lights. You know, we're not familiar with them or anything, but you know, oh, it's car lights. Well, you see car lights every night. You know how they move. You know what they look like at a distance, and then to say
Right.
all of you are wrong.
Mhm. It's and I feel like, and in words we have talked about this, and that has been a big issue with the Joplin. Coming back to the Joplin Spooklight,
Yeah.
is that the easy out, the easy answer is exactly what you said. It's under certain weather conditions, um, headlights from I-44.
No, you're back.
Hello.
Hello.
My energy stepped out for a moment. I don't know why. But with the Spooklight, the easy answer, and of course, coming back to Dark Ozarks, our tagline is there are no easy answers in some cases, and you have this situation where they're going, it's reflected or refracting the light of headlights from Interstate 44 under certain weather conditions, and making it appear that they show up elsewhere. And not naming any names, but there was a documentary that talked to some really compelling individuals who had firsthand experience with this. And
Oh, and a couple who are on the production staff of Dark Ozarks.
yeah, and and individuals who of course have seen the Spooklight, have experienced the Spooklight in multiple ways. Some of those experiences were in broad daylight, and in some cases very in very close proximity. And I think it was so funny watching that particular process as it had been put together. And you're like, wow, this is really good, because they're on the ground, they're embedded, they're connected, they do all of this, and then right on clockwork, before the 60 minutes are up, they just wrap it up. They have a cute little infographic, animated infographic, and shows light reflecting, explains that I-44 is here, that light under certain weather conditions can indeed be reflected, and say, okay, folks, we solved it. We're done.
Mm-hmm. Well, that was the easy answer, but
Yeah.
and certainly doesn't explain that the light is seen over several square mile radius and from all directions. But you've been out there, you know the spot they're talking about. They're talking about one particular spot on 50 Road, and if you're in the right spot with the right temperature inversion, and it usually takes a very wintry day for the conditions they're talking about, that you'll see a stream of headlights, but you'll see double lights, and just like you would, you know. But
Like you
of
would.
course, but the real interesting thing, though, too, that debunks headlights is that the light's been seen there for hundreds of years,
Predating
predating
I-44, of
cars.
course, predating Route 66, and predating automobiles. Yeah,
Yes. I
yeah.
mean, it was documented even on the Trail of Tears, and Native peoples had lore about it before that. So, you
Right.
know, someone might see a headlight on a particular circumstance, but it doesn't explain 99% of the cases.
And I think that is that is also something that people can learn from as well. We're not saying that the headlights can't refract. We can't say that they might not show up in certain situations under the right weather conditions.
Right.
But
Exactly.
that is not an adequate explanation for this. And one of the things that I'd be curious, and we may have already talked about this, but if so, I just kind of want to dig into it a moment. Of course, it's amazing country out there. It's just into Oklahoma. but there's been a lot of other documented paranormal activity, of course, we're not saying that the Spooklight is necessarily paranormal,
Right.
but there's been a number of documented paranormal activity moments that have been recorded in that area. Do you think that is leaning toward coincidence, or what do you think? What do you make of that?
I think it's sort of a convergence of factors. I think that I do tend to lean towards the light being some sort of natural phenomena, maybe geological based, or I'm not sure, some sort of energy. And it happens to coincide that it's, within a mile or two of Indian ceremonial land and the river. And so I think it's the chicken and egg question, really.
Yeah.
We're native peoples, and we're talking about different tribes over the years. Were they drawn to that spot because of something in the land? Some people have even said there's ley lines there, if you go into ley lines. And so was the energy there and they sensed it, and that's why they developed ceremonial land there, or not? I almost think it's a chicken and egg. And my guess is there was something peculiar about that area that drew them there.
I'm back. Yeah.
You're having all kinds of trouble tonight.
I am. I'm not doing anything different. Just hanging out over here. But but that makes sense. The again, we don't know which technically happened first. I do think the energy is different there, having been there. And I also think that the area itself is just really, really beautiful.
It is. It's an area that it draws you in. And then, of course, you have a lot of just legends in the area, with Devil's Promenade and the Deer Woman and the Goat Man and all kinds of things going on. So
yeah,
within a few square miles.
Right. And I think along with that, and to me, how it all ultimately ends up in terms of what can be documented and what can't. I think of what is a very important, and I've seen this happen many times, very important, is that each generation grows up. If they are unaware of these stories, it's sort of like the flavor of the culture, the flavor of the land. And if you grow up with these stories, even if you, for whatever reason, if you have to move away, or if you want to move away, or those types of things, there's a sense that I'm moving away from a place that has these stories, or I'm living in this place that has these stories. There's a sense of maybe a sense of pride, certainly a sense of place. The idea that you didn't just randomly happen, that you're part of some sort of larger tapestry of culture, and that means something, that it is expressed in some way, those types of things. And I think that's how cultures are built. And we have I feel like we do see more of that in Europe than we do here, and part of that is the fact that America is still a very young nation. But
we're very young, and also we have bought into the melting pot, so that people who came up, particularly in the 1900s, immigrants were under a lot of pressure to forget the old ways and forget the old country, change your names to make it more Anglo and fit in. And a lot of immigrant families didn't teach their children the old ways or the language, and so it was a lot of details were lost.
Mm-hmm. And then I think you get to World War II and the shift from an agrarian culture where things are more slow, where things move more slowly, to an industrialized culture, and then straight from a heavily industrialized culture into the suburbs by the 1950s and 60s.
Yeah.
And you have this sense of almost like the only culture that we have is the culture that has existed since I was born.
Very much, and I think television kind of contributed to that too. And often, what was portrayed about the past was very cardboard facade, especially when you talk about traditional westerns and things like that.
Right. And of course it's a little going off on a little bit of a tangent, but the real Old West in so many ways began Springfield, Joplin, and Fort Smith, Arkansas.
Oh yeah.
And the real Old West, but you actually have to take the Old West that was created in the 1950s and treat it as its own cultural entity, separate from the historical realities of the Old West, of which fringes of the Ozarks were a part.
Very true. And then a little later, you get more into some of the revisionist westerns, and ironically, the spaghetti westerns started that. Ones that were done in Italy, of all places, that actually portrayed there's that there are fairy tales for adults aspect to them, but on the other hand, it's the first time they really portrayed westerns more realistically as to the flavor of the Old West. The knitting.
And speaking of, this is inadvertently, or maybe you did it deliberately. I didn't. But fantastic segue.
Sure I did anything deliberately.
Talking about fairy tales, fantasy, and immigrants. In this particular case, Rose O'Neill, who was a first generation. Her father was from Ireland, and Rose has an interesting connection with the Ozarks.
Yes. Go ahead.
Oh my gosh, I've we're going to talk about Kewpie dolls. Aren't you excited? There's an increasing number of people don't even know what Kewpie dolls are anymore.
Yeah.
Some people do. Rose O'Neill created them, created the Kewpie doll around 1909. And she did so, we'll get into that, but it became an international phenomenon. The Kewpie doll became an international phenomenon that was really one of the first, if not the first, mass marketed pop culture merchandising items of the world, predating Mickey Mouse, predating all of Disney. And Rose O'Neill was an illustrator and a sculptor and an artist and a writer. And she was born in 1874, Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. Ultimately, her family moved to the Ozarks and actually Taney County, and when she was about 16. And her estate, what became the Rose O'Neill estate, is just north of Branson. A lot of people do not know that it's there. The mansion itself was built from pretty much the 1880s, 1890s in stages over several decades. As Rose O'Neill would make money in New York City and then send money home to her family, they would build more of the mansion until it was a multi-room, and it was a honest to goodness mansion. It was 3 stories tall. Yeah. Victorian mansion, multiple rooms. And then after Rose O'Neill passed away in 1944. And then 45 or 46, the mansion burned to the ground, and then was rebuilt, or a reconstruction of the mansion was done in the 1980s. And so you can go out there. They have a beautiful museum. You can tour the home, which is pretty as historically close to the original as possible. And Rose and many of her family members are actually buried in a family cemetery that is just down the Bonnie Brook, which she named. And it is both beautiful and a little haunting.
And I think let's also stress to people when we say, in a lot of ways, Rose was the exact opposite of what you expect from the Ozarks, and the exact opposite of sort of a lot of the people that we talk about in Dark Ozarks. She was very sophisticated, very well educated, very worldly, and actually one of the richest women in the world.
She was. Before the Depression, she was extraordinarily wealthy. She of course, she said that her favorite estate, her favorite home, was Bonnie Brook in the Ozarks. But she had an estate in Connecticut, which she called Castle Carabas. She had a villa on the Isle of Capri. And of course, bear in mind, this is the 1890s into, this is before the First World War. And Rose O'Neill was not only regularly traveling across the country, she was regularly traveling across the Atlantic. And and with the amount of money that she was making at the time, would have been doing so first class. So, obviously not on the Titanic, but we've all seen those old original images of, first class, in the Titanic, and everyone in their, the top hats and the ball gowns and all of that stuff. That was her life.
Yes. And so, so a lot of dark tales that we talk about, are not as debutante style, I guess you would say, but Rose really was.
Yes.
And very, very much almost a Renaissance woman, because she did a lot of different things and was interested in a lot of different things.
She was.
The Kewpies actually, didn't they come out of a dream, if I remember right?
They did. And there's and actually, maybe a little close to home, there was it wasn't the Spanish flu, but there was an influenza or a yellow fever epidemic that was sweeping the nation in probably around 1908, 1909. And Rose's younger brother, to whom she was very dedicated and devoted, she loved her younger brother very much. He helped an elderly woman off the train in Springfield, and then contracted the fever and died just a few days later. And Rose was devastated by the loss. And I think that the Kewpies were actually were born out of that grief. I don't know that. There's some suggestion in her writings that was the case. But it was after that experience that she said that she had fallen asleep in her art studio at Bonnie Brook in Taney County, and dreamed of these little Kewpies, these cherub children, the size of little fairies, dancing on her coverlet, on her quilt. And she woke up, drew them, and at the time, I think it was Ladies' Home Journal, had asked her to draw something for their Christmas issue. And so she drew out these spreads, and they were published for the Christmas of 1909 issue, and instantly became a U.S. phenomenon, and then an international phenomenon.
And there seems to be a lot of, really parallel with Kewpies and Faye.
Yeah, I would agree. There's, the suggestion, and this probably, there's people react to Kewpies differently.
I know.
Depending on the
Well, I'm going to let you off the hook here because I know someone shared our post with pictures of Rose with the Kewpies today and made the comment that they'd actually gone to school at College of the Ozarks, and that
awesome.
that they had, they always pushed the Kewpies for sales and so forth, but they creeped this person out.
And that is not uncommon.
Yes.
And I think from an emotional standpoint, an energy standpoint, and possibly even from a spiritual standpoint, there is something very divisive and powerful about these little dolls. Of course, from a long-standing historical anthropological perspective, dolls are powerful totems.
Well, they are often seen as vessels for souls.
Right. And which can be a little creepy all by itself. Not always bad. But there's and especially when you consider that the Kewpie might have, that its origin may have been born out of the energy of Rose O'Neill's grief.
True.
At the death of her younger brother. These are powerful things. There's of course the sort of the cherub concept, of course, which is not biblically accurate in terms of cherubs being cute little cupids. And of course, I think that the cupid is where the word, the Kewpie comes from, in that origin base. And Rose was, of course, also a very complex person, and she did have a sort of a very, one aspect of her persona was very glittering and very superficial. That, and one of her, and I can't, this is not a quote, but this is the basic gist. One of her ex-husbands said that they got divorced because he just couldn't stand to have her baby talk to him all the time.
Okay, fair.
and so, and that may be a little harsh, but that was, that aspect of the Kewpie history and the Kewpie culture is very real. It's sort of they're very sweet. They only do good things. They're very helpful, and they just are all goodness all the time. And something that I think is problematic with that is that it moves away from the yin and the yang. The fact that the life balance exists with the conflict between light and dark, and the Kewpie cult or Kewpie culture, depending on your perspective, says that it's all light, it's all good. And there's many people who see Kewpies, who are attached to their Kewpies, that there's a connection with them, and I think that it is a celebration, and in some cases maybe even a deification of innocence.
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement.
And I think I see similar things with some aspects of sort of and I having grown up of it as well, but the sort of the cult of Disney, all of the animation, and it's all bright and it's beautiful, and there's a certain connection of childhood innocence, and that can be very, very appealing, especially if you really experienced it as a child. I think that is the core.
That's true, but by the same token, and something that Disney's always kind of freaked me out, but is that there is always a little bit of the hook of, okay, everything's nice and innocent and beautiful, and we just killed Bambi's mother, or whatever. And
Yes.
I used to say, yes, Disney, but draw you in and then rip your heart out. There's always a bit of a dark turn
Yes.
that we kind of
Yes.
gloss over at the end. But do you feel there's a little bit of that with the Kewpies too?
Well, I think there are, but I think that Rose O'Neill poured all of that into other work, and that tends to make the Kewpie unbalanced in terms of yin and yang. That would be my feeling on that. And the individuals who adore the innocence of the Kewpie oftentimes overlook the complexity of the Kewpie creator, who is Rose. And Rose, and I don't mean this badly, but she went through a lot. She was a very complex, sophisticated, worldly woman who was eccentric, to say the least. And I would postulate that Rose, like all human beings, certainly had a dark side, and that she tried to express that primarily through her Sweet Monster exhibits and works, which are an incredible fusion of Celtic mythology, Greco-Roman mythology, and Art Nouveau. And that art was dismissed by the individuals who loved Kewpies, because they simply were not able to wrap their heads around, or did not seem to be able to wrap their heads around, that the mother of the Kewpie, the symbol of innocence, was also a full, multifaceted, complex human being with I hate to say a dark side, but a human side.
Well, and to be perfectly honest, her sweet monsters, and I've heard them called lovely monsters as well, they tended to be her favorites.
Yeah, and she was very private about them because of the dismissiveness. Her first, and this comes back to Rose as a complex individual, but also is very sophisticated, and she trained. Of course, she was a highly trained artist. But she trained under Rodin, Auguste Rodin, in Paris, and it was Rodin himself. And for people who don't know who Rodin is, the thinker, the classic, sculpture, bronze sculpture of the figure leaning over, which is dominant in Western culture as a core piece. Auguste Rodin was the person who looked at her work, and looked at her sophisticated, serious work as represented with the Sweet Monsters, and said, you need to do a public exhibition. So it was Rodin himself who encouraged Rose to do a public exhibition in Paris in 1920. And it was a huge success in Paris. And then she tried to do the same thing in New York in 1921, and crickets. The critics hated her work, the public hated her work, and to a large degree, I think she put it away. To me, that's very heartbreaking. And I think it is the dark side of innocence, that the public could only accept Rose's work and when it was positive and made them feel childlike and innocent, and
kind of superficial.
And very superficial, and I think that's just is a really heartbreaking side of fame and perception, and also I think a bit of a critique on American culture.
Well, I agree there. I think that a lot of it has to do with American culture and being a little, and particularly I think we're a little more in touch with sort of the roots of our Western lore. Not a lot, but a little more than 100 years ago.
Yeah.
And I think, to be perfectly honest, it's probably perceived as foreign, as European. And I have to wonder if part of it wasn't because Rose was a woman.
And it's
And
certainly not impossible.
and you know, and we're dealing with subjects that are not frivolous.
Right.
And so, you know, I hate to say that, but I've always wondered that if that went, you know, on this side of the pond, if that was part of it.
I think that is very, it is not impossible by any stretch of the imagination. I really do. And I think one of the things that might speak into that is that in that era and from that perspective, the Kewpie could kind of get a free pass because it was sort of the innocence of childhood and the beauty of motherhood combined.
Right. It was that picture. And I mean, this was also right at the same time as women getting the right to vote and so forth. And so there was a lot of treading water for images and going on. And also, I mean, we were just coming out of World War I, and this is the age of the Great Gatsby and so forth, and sort of the wasteland, and let's, you know, have expensive parties and drink ourselves silly and not think.
Right. Right. And that's the Sweet Monsters, which I encourage anybody to check those out. The Sweet Monsters is some of my favorite art of all time, and it is deeply thought-provoking, and in some cases even to the point of making people uncomfortable, which of course I think art should in many cases make people uncomfortable. It also is important for art to be beautiful and exquisite and those types of things, but I think the really profound art is the art that challenges our perceptions, and Sweet Monsters do that.
And you know, it's just partly I think it's a statement at that time. I have to wonder if they were premiered now, what the reaction might be.
Well, I think one of the things, and this is a cultural shift that I guess I'm proud to say I've been in the crux of, right in the middle. I in all fairness, and you know where I'm going with this. In all fairness, there was I was just mildly thought Kewpies were cute. My sister had a little porcelain Kewpie doll. It was a cute one. I didn't think it was a creepy one. But I was just like, oh, that's cool. And I always had an interest in like trolls and ogres and fae and fairy tales and all that stuff. So it just kind of was lumped into magical, and that's cool. But it wasn't something I thought a lot about. Then first year of State of the Ozarks, I found out about Bonnybrook and went out and wrote my first article. I've written 3 articles and been to multiple events at Bonnybrook. It's an incredible place. And as I then came back and was talking to people my age, and specifically younger than me, saying, oh, it's a Kewpie doll. And they're like, what's a Kewpie doll? And I'm like, well, it's one of these. And they go, ah! And they're like, that is the creepiest damn thing I have ever seen in my entire life. And I'm like, this? Okay. And so it really is this cultural divide. And then that culminated last year, I think, or 2 years ago. Last year.
I think it was.
I think it was last year with Writers Artist Night, which we're doing again. And so a friend, very, very smart, sophisticated friend, challenged me and said, and also a C of O grad who's very, very similar to what said, I used to have to work at the Ralph Foster Museum, and we would have to go in there before it opened, and we'd have to be there after dark and I would have to walk by the Kewpie collection, and it would scare the hell out of me. And I am terrified of those things. And there's just something, he goes, you know, there's just something incredibly creepy about those. And I'm like, what if I wrote a horror story about Kewpie dolls? And he's like, oh my gosh, Josh, do it. You've got to do it. So I did. It was tongue in cheek. It was just something I threw together literally in one evening. It was well received. You were there. And then I published it. And oh my gosh, I got so much hate mail for destroying the innocence of the Kewpie. And how dare I do that? And I'm like, oh, I finally put, honest to goodness, put a trigger warning on the top of the page to say, this is my disclaimer. If you're easily triggered by, you know, dark stories involving Kewpies, please read no further. Unfortunately, I haven't had any hate mail since then. This may spur on another season of it. And for people that hate me for hating on the Kewpies, I think they're cute. But I also understand that if you shift your perspective on them just a little bit, they can be not cute.
Well, and you know, I think there's something, there really is something to the fact that something that appears very innocent and cute can have a more unsettling effect if that image, if the perspective is turned just slightly versus something that is grotesque, because you already expect that. You already expect something unsettling from something that's grotesque. And I'm saying grotesque from the artistic view of art, of grotesque.
Yes, I agree. I agree very much. It's sort of like the twin girls in The Shining.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a good cinematic comparison, really. That you just, and I love Kewpies, don't get me wrong, but sometimes I just look at them and go, I just really wonder, do they come to life at night?
I know. And now, for the record, I did have one person on the internet contact me and ask me if my horror Kewpie doll story was a true story.
Yes.
And I'm like, yes, the Kewpie dolls really did come to life and try to kill me. Really, really happened, guys. But I think, and this is the haunting part, when you realize that the inspiration for these dolls may have been born out of the grief of death. There is a dark side to the Kewpie. It's just a dark side that I think people are uncomfortable in certain situations with, and I think that there's and exactly what you said. I remember asking somebody, what is it specifically about them that creeps you out so much? And they're like, they look so innocent that you just wonder what's really under there.
Right. And I think that's fair. And to flip it back to lore, that is the basis of the cautionary tale with fairies, etc.
Very good point.
Yeah.
They're dangerous because they look so good in some cases.
And maybe that's sort of almost a trace memory of generational memory of just that perception of the fae. And so when you see something like that, if you come from that, and maybe this is it, maybe if you come from that tradition, that there's something in the back of your mind that says, oh, wait a minute, maybe I should be cautious.
Maybe I should back away from this.
And so then if you haven't been brought up in that more Nordic or Celtic traditions that adhere more to those ideas, then you may just see it more as that just little innocent doll.
And really, I think that would be very interesting. That is really sort of a generational memory or an ancestral memory or a genetic memory, and that would be I would be very interested in doing some analysis on that. Something that is to me equally a haunting, and for people who know some of the history and are willing to read some subtext into the story, I actually wrote it into that short story. But the fact that ultimately at the end of the day, Rose O'Neill passed away in 1944. At the end of the day, she died in poverty, with her beloved mansion literally rotting away around her. Between the Depression and the beginning of the Second World War, she had essentially no money, and within that process, a big part of that process was that she was attempting to do new work. She was attempting to launch new art that would sustain her, and the public refused to have any interest in it because she was the mother of the Kewpie. The only thing that they wanted was Kewpies. And to me, that is devastating, and sort of the idea that the Kewpies ultimately consumed her. It's almost like Crossroad Demon.
Well, yes, and it's and if for a pop cultural comparison, it's like the aging typecast actor or actress that ends up not being able to transition, and they end up dying, and people, oh my, how'd they end up so poor when they'd been so successful? Well,
because people
they didn't accept them as other than the stereotype, and that's kind of what happened to Rose.
It is, and you think about that level of emotional devastation from having gone from so high, so world renowned, wealthy beyond her dreams, to dying impoverished with people saying, we're not going to buy your work. It's not a Kewpie. And that, to me, because there was, and just a lot of bad luck, but she unveiled, it was going to change the world. She was going to do it all over again. And she unveiled another doll, but this one was Asian themed, and it was set to be released December of 1941. So literally days after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. And she's trying to market a essentially Japanese themed doll series that of course nobody cared. And then her last effort was, of course, during World War II, and she was trying to do war pinup art, which of course she was a fantastic artist with a extraordinary understanding of the human form, and nobody would buy it because they're going, that's like practically pornographic, and you're the mother of the Kewpie. We're not going to give you any money.
Right. If she'd marketed it under another name, it might have sold. Yeah. And there's just, so there's, I think in some senses, the almost the curse of the Fae is on this. Yeah, I mean, I think you can. It's almost a real life example of that. And the Fae often would come in dreams too. So
yes, and grant all your gold, but would, in case you didn't read the fine print, it comes with a cost.
Exactly. And I mean, it's almost a textbook illustration of that in real life, unfortunately. And
it really is.
And then if to be honest, I mean, it really goes back to the nature of the Dark Ozarks show, is that there are no easy answers. And here, someone with talent beyond imagination and wealth beyond almost imagination to basically the success causing so much grief and ultimately poverty.
Yes. Yes.
That's certainly not an answer you would expect. I mean, it was not an easy answer in any shape or form.
No, it isn't. And it's, and there is, have you been to Bonnybrook? I don't remember.
I have a long, it's probably been 15, 18 years ago. It's been quite a long time ago.
To me, there's a very unique energy there that can be unsettling. I love it out there, but it can be unsettling.
The time that I was there, I just felt it was very electric. Is the only thing I can say. I just felt almost electricity in the air. I'd have to go back and really think. And we may well be there in this project, but
it'd be really cool.
But it was just something that it was almost electrifying, but not necessarily just in an exciting way. It was just intense.
Just intense. Yes. I think that's very fair. Yeah. Well, we just uncovered a real life Faye story.
We did, and we didn't even plan it per se.
I know. Oh.
Well, we sure appreciate everyone for listening in. And Wednesday, we will be over on Instagram at 8 Eastern, 7 Central. And then we will be back over here on Facebook on Friday evenings. So we appreciate everybody. And, if you haven't liked the page here, like the page on Instagram, get involved, ask questions, give us your opinions. We're interested in it. It helps.
Yes,
and I guess we could say we are starting to film again, finally. So hopefully, we have more news before too long, but filming is resuming. Although, not full scale yet, but we're getting there. So things do proceed.
Yes. And we're excited. We thank you all for just following it. If you have questions, comments, or things that we'd like to cover, that you'd like us to cover, that we'd like you to cover, anyway, please let us know. And message Dark Ozarks either through Facebook or Instagram, and we'll do our best to figure it out.
Yes, we will.